Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers the Nike anti-aircraft missile with launcher and crew. It's a 1/32 scale kit from Revell, previously a Renwal blueprinter release, and it's kit number 85-7815 from the Selected Subjects program that Revell rolled out a couple of years back. Released in 2013, this kit includes 80 parts, molded in dark green with white styrene and waterslide decals. Now, Revell rates this a level 2 for the intermediate builder, and it was initially released in the 60s, but it takes me back to the days around Chicago area when I lived near one of these Nike bases that had the radar installation and, of course, underground silo. So back in the Cold War, of course, they were always arranged about 100 miles from major cities to act as interceptors for bomber attacks. So we're going to get started here, and you can take a look at some finished shots of the model and the crew, and then we'll get right down to business. When completed, the kit will be about 10 inches long, 9 inches wide on the launcher, and about 11 inches high when erected. Now here's the layout of the kit, and as you can see, the parts are separately bagged, and it does come with decals, which we'll talk about later. But we'll be using mostly some liquid cement for construction, occasionally some super glue. But please remember to follow any of the manufacturer's guidelines for safety when you use or hear any of the products seen in the review. As I mentioned, decals came with the kit, and the register is pretty good. They're very colorful, but in fact, for me, they were too colorful. I expect these were probably only issued, or if ever, for photo op type, displays of the missile. So I didn't use them, but that's up to you. You can use them. I would suggest you use some of the setting solutions to help them conform to the body of the model. Before construction, I washed all the parts off in some mild soap and warm water and then let them air dry. And while that was going on, I studied the instruction sheet to get an idea of how to construct the kit. We'll start with these parts to construct the elevating rail, so go ahead and remove those and clean up any burrs from the sprue attachment points and any flash. The elevating piston for this unit has a chrome finish, so to get that look, I'll paint it with some alclad chrome paint, starting with a coat of gloss black, and when this is dry, the alclad chrome will be applied. Then I painted the elevating cylinder halves with some Testors acrylic semi-gloss black. The cylinder cap gets a coat of olive drab paint, as that's an Army unit. Next, I used a little thin liquid cement and assembled the elevating piston. Then we'll place the elevating piston on the pivot point on the elevating rail, and then glue the two halves together using the Testors liquid cement. After the glue dried, I used some squadron putty to fill all the seams on the rail on all sides, and then let that dry. I then sanded it with some 400 grit sandpaper to give it a pretty smooth finish. And finally, I applied a coat of primer to the entire elevating rail. I left the masking on the cylinder, and then I painted the entire thing with Testors olive drab, along with some of the other components for the rail. Next, we'll assemble the slide rails, the pivot pin guard, and the elevating cylinder after the paint has dried to the elevating rail. So locate these components for step 2 and remove them from the tree and clean up any attachment points. The spring portion and the stanchion cap have a chrome finish, so once again I'll paint those with some alclad gloss black, and when that dries, a coat of alclad chrome to give it that chrome finish. The ground pad will get painted semi-gloss black. You can see the hole in the center, and so go ahead and let that dry. Now glue the elevating piston hinge to the cylinder cap using some thin liquid cement. Next, the cylinder cap and the mounting plate and the launcher's frames are painted with the olive drab paint. Place the piston cap over the pivot pin on the power unit and then glue the two halves together using some liquid cement. After the glue has dried, apply some putty to the seams all the way around the unit. And once the putty is dry, sand it off with some 400 grit dry sandpaper. Mask off the chrome pieces and apply a coat of primer to the entire elevating rail. Then, after the primer dries, go ahead and paint the power unit with some acrylic drab paint in the olive shade. Assemble the elevating rail and the launcher frames to the power unit using some liquid cement. Remember to scrape off any paint in the area where you're going to glue joints together so that you get a good bond. Now you'll notice here there are some clamps that allow them to dry in position properly. A lot of this model is functional and can be oriented in different positions, and this shows the elevating rail fully extended. Grab the side rails from the kit and we'll paint those olive drab, and then we can glue the side rails to the power unit using the same liquid cement. Next, we'll locate these components from the sprue trees and arrange them for assembly to complete the end rails. First, I can paint the ground pads with some semi-gloss black. The adjusters and the stanchion cap have a chrome finish, and once again, to get the look, I will paint it first with some all-clad gloss black, and then when that dries, a coat of chrome from all-clad. Next, the end rails and the launcher supports will get painted olive drab. Now we can finish up step 4 by gluing the mounting plates and the ground pads to the end rails and the launcher supports. Now get these components out of the kit for the loudspeaker, and then paint the loudspeaker after you cleaned it up with some olive drab paint. Now we'll go ahead and glue the end rails, the supports, and the loudspeaker to the main structure using some liquid cement to complete step 5. And also remember to scrape off any paint so that the glue will have a good chance to bond the plastic. Locate these parts for the missile launch rail and clean them up and stage them for construction. Place the support over the pivot pins and glue the two halves together using some liquid cement, and then use some small clamps to hold the parts together while it dries so that you minimize the seam. And after that is done, apply some putty to the seams, and once dried you can sand that off with 400 grit sandpaper. And then after you're done with that and it looks good, add some primer to the entire missile launch rail. After the primer has dried, paint the unit with some of that olive drab paint. Gather up these components for the launch rail assembly, and then we're going to remove those from the tree and clean them up, and then glue the missile launch rail supports together using some liquid cement and clamp them together and prime them with some primer. Now paint the supports with some Tester's acrylic olive drab paint. Now we can glue the supports onto the launch rail using some liquid cement. To complete step 7 in the instructions, we can now slide the launch rail onto the main assembly. Next we'll start on the booster section of the missile. So find these components and remove them from the tree and clean up the edges and sprue connections tabs. Use some liquid cement and glue all the parts together, and then clamp them with some clothespins to keep them in contact. Then fill the few seams and voids with some putty, and after that's dry, sand it off smooth with some 400 grit dry paper. Then apply a coat of white primer to the booster section. After the primer had dried, I placed the booster onto the launch structure to mock it up and see how it would fit. Find all the components for the missile section, and once again clean up any sprue tabs or flash that exists. Place the ailerons, control fins, and the aileron and fin retainers into one of the missile halves, and then place the other half on it and carefully apply some liquid cement to the seams, but don't get the glue onto the pivoting ailerons or fins. I used some clothespins to clamp the halves together then, and while this was drying I glued on the fins and the antennas. Look it over, and I found one spot on my sample just above the fins that needed a little putty, so I filled it in and sanded it off, and then I applied some white primer to the entire missile. After the paint had dried, I placed the missile on the booster section and the launch rail. Now it was time to work on our brave crew members who were frozen in plastic for posterity. One of them, however, had an inversed hunchback, a real big sink that had to be filled, so I used some putty and filled it in, then smoothed it out, and once that was done I applied some Tamiya primer to all the figures. I used a dot of glue to the bottom, applied to the bottom of the feet, and attached the figures to some tongue depressors to hold them while I was painting. And then I painted all of the figures with some olive drab paint. In this group of photos on the top left, you see I painted the boots with some leather, and then on the bottom left I painted the hands and faces with some of the flesh color, and the bottom right I painted the rifle with some acrylic wood from testers, and the barrel with some enamel silver, and then brought out some of the details with some black and white pastel chalks applied generously to their uniforms. Well, there you have it. The missile and the crew and the launcher are complete. It's a nice looking display when it's finished, and pretty accurately represents the actual Nike missiles that were on hand back in the Cold War days. You can complete this in just a few hours right out of the box, or you can take a little more time on it like I did and add some chrome accents and fill all the seams for some extra detail. Either way, it's a nice little kit, and if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. We hope you liked this premium step-by-step scale model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. But you can find us on Facebook and at our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks!